2 video of the AFC tuning and tweaking.
Holy shnikes.
My buddy's truck, I'm hot rodding here for him. 96 12 valve. I did a video the other day where I kind of showed all the stuff I was doing to it. I briefly went over what this AFC kind of does, and I put some air pressure into the back port here. Normally, this would be a reference line coming from the turbo or coming from the charge tubing or intake manifold. So as our engine is making boost, the boost will come in here. The air acts on this diaphragm. Everything inside here slides ahead. The star wheel that everybody talks about is down inside here. Let's see if we can see that. You can see that piece with the teeth on it. That's the star wheel. I just wanted to mention this. Looking down into the hole, I could see that the teeth were really far forward, and someone had already loosened this off big time. Normally when you pop out that plug and you're looking at the star wheel, it's a lot closer to the center of that hole. So someone had already loosened this one off big time. And that spring there, if we wheel the star wheel one way or the other, we move this adjustment collar backward or forward. If we move it forward, which is to the front of the engine, the spring gets looser. If we move that collar to the rear of the engine, the spring tension gets tighter. So let's say with 10 pounds of boost coming in here, if you have that spring looser or tighter, this will travel more or travel less. It'll also travel sooner or travel later. And what we're moving is this AFC foot, and the AFC stands for air fuel control. Basically, that's what this piece is. The P-pump has a couple pieces that control the fueling. We have the air fuel control, which is fuel based off of reference to boost. We have a mechanical fuel plate. This is fuel reference to RPM, and this fuel plate sits in like this. When we first take the AFC housing off, everything is pointed down. This is sticking down in your pump, but when it's all together, it's like this. So we can see what it kind of normally looks like. Let's see. Let me just stand this up like this. And that's your plate adjustment. When people say they slide their plate full forward or rearward or wherever, this is your fueling, your rack travel that you're adjusting. The governor arm comes in contact with, first it actually comes in contact with the AFC foot. When you first start a truck up and you have no boost coming into the AFC housing, that governor arm comes in contact with the AFC foot. And that is the amount of fuel that we can put into that engine with no boost. The smoke screw, let me take that off. This had tamper-proof screws as well. The smoke screw or pre-boost screw, the adjustment on this pre-boost screw, what it actually does is it mechanically pushes on the center where that diaphragm is. It pushes the whole rod forward. So the smoke screw adjustment actually sets this AFC foot position. So what we do there, when I'm just sitting in a truck, how I will adjust this. When I'm in a truck, I start it up, it's sitting there idling. If you just trump your throttle, just whack the throttle to the floor, quickly rev it, what you see coming out the tailpipe, that is controlled by this smoke screw. That is the amount of fuel this injection pump will inject with no boost reference. With no boost reference, this AFC foot can't move. So the governor arm can't move any farther. The governor arm essentially is attached to the fuel rack in the injection pump. So yeah, smoke screw setting is this. We're changing the initial position of the AFC foot, which changes our pre-boost fueling. And again, start the truck up, just let it idle, and just whack the throttle to the rug. That quick brap on the throttle. If you want, a more aggressive, quicker spooling setup, sometimes we'll screw this in a little bit. This is a really, really finicky, fine adjustment. A little bit too much and the truck can be a little bit lazy It won't spool up as good, not enough, same thing. It can actually feel a little bit lazy, won't spool up that well. This is a really, once you kind of find the sweet spot, man, it's only a little bit of a turn one way or the other. Quick jump in here. When I adjust these, I'll have it off on the bench. The arrow on the right hand side of this picture, that is the pre-boost screw. So I will break the 10mm nut free. I will back that screw out. I'll back it out until the AFC foot isn't moving anymore, and then I will slowly screw it back in until I just see the AFC foot starting to move. I will stop there. This helps me because I know now this is the least amount of pre-boost adjustment I can have. So if I put it on the truck now and it's still too smoky when I brap on the throttle, me screwing it out isn't doing anything because you can't really see inside the AFC once it's on the vehicle. So if I didn't know I was already at the minimum position, it could be bolted on and I would back the screw out, think I'm doing something, but I'm not doing anything. So I try to set it at the absolute minimum position, and then I know where to go from there. What most people do, they remove this cap, they just whale that thing all the way in, and guys are blowing smoke and it's kind of goofy, it's kind of hillbilly, because we're trying to match the amount of fuel to the air that the engine is consuming. And it's just like a gas engine. If we're too rich or too lean, the engine's not going to run very efficient. So that's what we do with this piece. We're essentially matching the amount of air we have available, and then we're setting up the amount of fuel that we're going to give to match that amount of air. So if we want things running a little bit richer, the first step would be setting the starting point for the AFC foot a little bit more farther forward, which is essentially the rack can travel a little bit farther with no boost reference. The fuel plate, the governor actually travels, as RPMs increase, this little knife edge of a governor arm travels on these arcs here, and it will rise up. A stock fuel plate's a really crazy looking profile. I'd love to talk to the engineers on why they did what they did, but when you see an aftermarket fuel plate, you can kind of make more sense of it. Lots of plates at low RPM. I'm going to get a felt pen here. I'm going to show you. Lots of plates at low RPM. Well, there's all different plate profiles, but let's say we could have a plate profile that looks like, let's say it's a ramp and it looks like this. So at low RPM, there's not a lot of fuel available. Now you have to imagine this thing working. I start my truck up, I put it into gear, I step on the throttle. As soon as I step on the throttle, I have the amount of fuel available where this AFC foot is. And I have that from the smoke screw. As I turn this in, that foot will move farther forward. So let's just say this is our starting position. This is where it was stock. So the governor arm is in contact with here. Gonna jump in here quick again. The governor arm is, let's say, the green arrow on the left. That leading edge of that governor arm. When we fire up our truck and it's just running, it's gonna be a couple millimeters off there. And when you brap the throttle, let's say it's 4 millimeters back, and when you brap the throttle, that little governor arm knife edge will move into the AFC foot, and that amount of distance it's allowed to move is how much the rack is allowed to move. So what I was saying just before this wasn't quite correct. The governor arm isn't sitting on the AFC. It's sitting just off the AFC at idle position, and when we brap on the throttle, the governor arm, which essentially is the rack, gets to move that little bit of a distance to hit the AFC foot. Essentially, that is the rack. That's how much fuel we have available with no boost. I'll step on the throttle. The truck will start to fuel. It'll start to make some boost. Air will go into here. It will fill up this diaphragm. It'll push on the diaphragm. The AFC foot now will move out of the way. Once the AFC foot moves out of the way, now the governor arm can follow this is fuel versus RPM. So kind of the first step is to make sure you have boost before you get fuel. So you're not just plowing in a bunch of fuel. And then once you have boost, the AFC foot moves out of the way, and now we're going to follow the ramp profile of a plate. So essentially, let's just call this 0 RPM. Let's just call this 4,000 RPM. So as RPMs increase, the governor arm can travel farther. And lots of times, a lot of plates on the top end will also pull back fuel. An engine isn't moving. An engine has a kind of a volumetric, an airflow graph, let's say. Peak torque is actually when an engine is most volumetric efficient. As RPMs increase, airflow drops off on an engine, so fuel flow can also drop off to match that. Lots of guys will just chop this plate right off. They'll do it straight. I think you can just chop this off right straight, but then you imagine as soon as the AFC foot moves out of the way, at 0 RPM, we could have the maximum amount of fuel that this engine could consume at 3,000 RPM. So these are kind of the hillbilly things that people do. They will cut really weird profiles, and man, all this kind of works. It can work. You can pull the plate out. My COALSTANG doesn't even have a plate right now. Like, I don't tow. My car basically goes from 0 throttle to wide open throttle, and I actually adjust the transition with just the AFC foot. I'm probably going to put a plate in at one time when I really start fine-tuning things, but yeah, that shape I was drawing was kind of, aftermarket fuel plates will have a certain shape. And actually, instead of buying a plate, you can grind your own. You can just grind your own shape. But it's kind of like cutting a 2x4. If you cut too short, you can't cut again to get your measurement. So you'll just kind of trim and keep working it. If you want more fuel on the bottom end, you'll cut this line deeper, lower down on the plate. If you want more fuel on the top end, you'll cut deeper on the top. What I would love to see, and I've never seen it, and I've researched this to death, some engineer, some Bosch engineer, somebody somewhere would know the exact measurements and where the RPMs are. Let's say the bottom of the plate is 0 RPM. Let's say 100,000ths of an inch up from the bottom of the plate has to be a specific RPM. They would know this because they want X amount of fueling at certain RPM. And I've never seen that. I would love to know what the measurements are. Let's say, where's 3,000 RPM? I want to know that. And if 3,000 RPM is here, then I can start to cut my profile. Let's say I got a truck and I don't want it fueling big time at 1,500 RPM. If I know at the height at which the governor arm is hitting this plate at 1,500 RPM, I could then, maybe I won't dig so deep when I build a custom plate at that 1,500 RPM height. I hope you guys are following me with that, but like, it's a really simple thing, but it's a little bit complicated. But that, again, I wish someone had a chart that would show me exactly what height is what RPM. Jumping in here quick again. I did have an idea. I was going to take some blueprinting dye, like you can do spray paint, and I could put it on the leading edge of the fuel plate, stick it in my pump, fire the truck up, rev it up to that, whatever number I want, 3,000 RPM. Just rev it up to 3,000 RPM for a minute or so, shut the truck off, pull the plate out, and see if the leading edge of the governor arm has scraped the blue dye off. Because when you pull out a factory or any fuel plate that's been in there for a couple thousand miles, you'll see where it's been rubbing. But you see the entire spectrum of where it's been rubbing. I want to know exactly where, let's say, 3,000 RPM is. Okay, back to the other stuff. But, so what will we do now? I'll show you what I'm going to do to this AFC. Well, let's go back 1 second. Let's say I got a fuel plate in there. And yesterday I measured, when I put air into here on a stock AFC housing, I only got about 8 millimeters of travel out of this foot. It would only move forward 8 millimeters. A fully maxed out AFC is going to be about 14 to 15 millimeters of travel. So what happens is, if you don't have this maxed out, it don't matter what you have for a plate. Let's say you pull the plate right out. You now have no mechanical fuel versus RPM. You have no ramp. As soon as this AFC moves out of the way, the governor's going full fuel. It doesn't care if it's 0 RPM. It don't care if it's 5,000 RPM. But if we're only getting 8 millimeters of travel, and we know that we can get about 15 out of this, we have what do we got? We got 7 millimeters of travel left, and that's 7 millimeters of rack travel. That is fuel, that is power. So to put that into perspective, a P pump, a P7100 pump, the rack has 21 millimeters of travel, total travel that you can get out of the pump. So when we fully max out a pump and we want all the travel, all the fuel, that's what we would shoot for, is 21 millimeters of rack travel. Now this thing's only moving 8 millimeters. So you see there's a lot of gains to be had here. And as I talk about this, there's just so many little details. We don't need 21 millimeters out of this AFC foot. What happens is when a truck fires up, from what I'm kind of guesstimating and what I see, I believe that governor arm and the rack travels probably 5, 6, 7, 8 millimeters of travel just to start the vehicle and get it idling. So let's say we're at 8 millimeters of travel here. See, we're probably about 6 or 7 millimeters, I believe, when it first hits like a stock setting on an AFC foot. I'm thinking it goes 6 or 7 millimeters. And then a stock AFC housing without cutting 100,000 off the barrel, without modifying the washers inside, a stock AFC foot will only move 8 millimeters. So imagine we have our initial 5, 6, 7 millimeters. We can add 8 millimeters to that, so we're 13 to 15 millimeters is the max you're going to get out of a stock unmodified AFC housing. Even if you throw the plate in the weeds, you could have the biggest injectors in the world, you could have full cut delivery valves, you could have all the rankest stuff on your injection pump. If this AFC foot doesn't move far enough, we can't get to that 21 millimeters of rack travel. Essentially, we're at only about 15 millimeters of rack travel. So there is a huge gain to maxing this out. I think a lot of people, they'll build their combos. They might do 1 or 2 mods here, but if you don't do all the mods and you don't kind of check after to see that you're getting full travel, there's massive amounts of horsepower that's left on the table. So let's take a look at this. Pop these out. Oh, I tightened that one up. We're going to pop this cap off of here. I like to have a little magnetic tray to hold all this stuff. Comes in handy. Yeah. These are actually pretty tight. When you first take these apart, man, that's why I use a screwdriver with a hex on it. And I'll lean on it pretty hard, and you got to crack it with the crescent wrench pretty hard. Okay, so here, so you can see what happens. We're going to take the back half off. This is our smoke screw. This is where the boost reference goes in. So immediately what we see is, this is the diaphragm. And you see how that screw now, the screw will mechanically push on the center of this rod, and it will adjust the initial setting of that AFC foot. That's what that is. So this comes off. Now we see, you'll hear about the washer mod. Like if you Google, everybody says you got to do the washer mod with the pump. So I measured this yesterday, and that foot's only moving about 8 millimeters. From that neutral position, it's only getting about 8 millimeters. But you can hear this. You can hear something's coming in contact and limiting travel. So if we look at that washer right there. This washer. It's got a big lip on it. Actually, so I'm going to take this, I have this loosened off as well. This adjusts the height of the AFC foot. We won't go into that right now, but I just always put it back where it was. Pop this out. This thing's kind of a pain in the butt to get off lots of times, but there's actually a little there's a little notch right there where you can put in your screwdriver and pop it out of there. I've already had this one apart, so it kind of pops out easy, but there's an O-ring here. So this piece comes out. The AFC foot now comes out. And now we see, I loosened this off already too. So on the back side, here's the spring, the AFC spring. Underneath that is that star wheel. And that's what we adjust through here. So you imagine that's on there. This is on here. I'll just show you like this. As we crank on that star wheel, if we move it rearward, it will make more tension on this spring. If we move it to the front, the spring will get looser and it'll be less tension. So now X amount of boost, let's say 10 PSI of boost. If we have this really tight, 10 PSI of boost will only move the foot so far. If we have it really loose, 10 PSI of boost will move the foot farther, quicker, earlier. So back to the washer mod. So what we do, you can see this washer, look at that lip on there. What I do is I'll grind off that lip. Some people will put a smaller washer in here, but I just take and I grind that lip off. Jumping in quick again. I grind the lip off that washer because that's an interesting washer. On the back side where the diaphragm touches it, it's rounded a little bit. And I just think over time, a sharp-edged washer might start to cut or wear out that diaphragm as it's moving back and forth. So I just grind that lip off, leave it in its location, done. Because what happens is the lip comes in contact with the housing here, and you can actually see, you can see it. You can see marks right there. So that's actually what's limiting the travel. That's the first part that's limiting the travel. That's all, we get 8 millimeters of travel when that washer hits there. So what we want to do, we'll disassemble this. I will take and I will grind that edge right off so it's flat. Some people will just replace it with a flat washer. Whatever you want to do, it don't matter. And then what happens, once you grind off that washer, we gain, I think it was like 4 millimeters. Once you grind off that washer now, where is the old AFC foot? What happens, the AFC foot is riding in there. And now once we get rid of that, once we do the washer modification, this thing will travel a lot farther now. And this barrel will actually hit the front of the case. I'll just kind of, you can just, it ends up doing this. So now what we do, next step, we will take this AFC foot and you'll measure back 100 thousandths of an inch from the edge here. Measure back 100 thousandths of an inch. I cut it off. I make sure there's no sharp burrs because this slides really smoothly on this piece. I don't want it catching or anything weird happening. So I'll cut it off. I'll just kind of buff everything nicely. So once we have the washer mod completed, we cut 100 thou off of the foot. We will assemble everything back together. I'll put this piece back in the exact same location it was. And then for the hell of it, I always like to test them. So I will put everything together and I will take my little air pressure deal. You can even do it with just compressed air, but I like my little test unit here. It's a little vacuum and pressure tester. So I will stab her in there and I'll pump it up and I'll see at what pressure it starts to move. I'll see at what pressure it maxes itself out, and I will also measure the travel. And we want to shoot the best, I think the most I've ever got was about like 14.8 millimeters. I've heard of some people getting more. They might be going to an even smaller diameter washer so it doesn't even contact the inside here. That smaller diameter washer will even go in and go past it. But a couple kind of knowledgeable dudes that I talked to told me if we can achieve about 14 to 15 millimeter on the AFC, we will be able to get max travel on our rack within the injection pump. We will be able to get to 21 millimeters of rack travel, which is, that's all we can get. And you are going to be boogieing and you will have a lot of fuel and be able to make a lot of power. So what else? Once we do this too, this is where the Mac rack plug comes into play. Once you max out all the AFC adjustments, this AFC foot's going to come out of the way. The actual rack within the pump is going to be able to move very far. And once it can move, once you have all the AFC mods done, there's a plug here in the back of the pump, and there's a rack. It's like a L-shaped piece of steel that is connected to all the plungers. That L shape will bump in, it bottoms out inside that plug. So you'll get yourself a Mac rack plug, install it in here. I actually do it on the truck. You can take a die grinder and I cut away. If you feel inside the back side of the case, there's actually a really deep hole. And I will cut a notch out of the top here, flush with the depth of that hole. And once you do that, you can pull this thing right out the top. You might not want to do that if you don't want to cut up your front case, but you would have to then pull the injection pump back. You got to disassemble everything so you can get at that. So I like to just notch out the top and then I can pull it out. But jumping in here quick, I have a post on Instagram way back where I actually show doing it. So here it is, step by step. That's where you start. Then I took my die grinder with like a 2-inch cutoff wheel and I just laid her in there and just buzzed it out. So it worked pretty good. Then you don't have to take the pump off to change the Mac rack plug. Again, that's the last step in getting all the travel out of the rack in an injection pump. So back to the video. That's going to achieve you that full 21 millimeters of rack travel. And I think the Mac rack plug, when I measured, it adds about 2 millimeter. So let's say we did all the AFC mods. We got all the full travel happening out of the AFC. Essentially, we'd be able to get to about 19 millimeters of rack travel. And then we have to do that Mac rack plug. I think I have. Oh, I should have had that handy. I have one of them, but I don't know where the hell it is right now. But the Mac rack plug gains you about an extra 2 millimeters of travel. So, okay. AFC now is fully modded. She's hot rodded. So all the washer mods have been done. 100 thous cut off the barrel foot. I make sure everything slides super free. I buff that. I'll run a little chainsaw file down the middle to make sure there's no burrs on the inside. Make sure everything's moving real nice. Lube it up. So now when I pressure test it, and 1 second. Hold. Now when I pressure test it, I just did, but I don't got 3 hands. So I'm going to pump this up. We got a lot of travel now. But it's stopping. When I measured it, it stops at about 13. And what's happening now, the stock star wheel setting, how do I explain this? You'll have coil bind. If you know what coil bind means, when you have a coil spring and you go to collapse it, at some point all the coils are going to touch and it can't compress anymore. So what happens now with all this travel, with the setting that it's at now, coil bind is actually what's holding me back that last little bit. This truck isn't going to need this max, you know, it ain't going to be, we're not shooting for 700 or 800 horsepower out of a big system here. I am going to loosen off the star wheel just a little bit, and if I did right now, if I loosened it right off, you would see this travel all the way. But where it's set right now, it wasn't really smoking that much. It's having coil bind now, and it's limiting the last little bit of travel there. So we might loosen it up a little bit. When I take it for a test drive, I'll see what it does. I'll see how nicely it kind of ramps in the fuel. I'll watch the tailpipe and see what that looks like. If I can loosen it up a little bit, I will. And once I loosen it a bit, that's gonna relieve that coil bind and it's gonna get me that last little bit of travel out of the AFC. But yeah, she's done. Pretty cool. Okay, so here's why I like to test. The spring, someone had actually loosened off the star wheel quite a bit, so it wasn't in coil bind. This fuel plate, the location this fuel plate was in and the location the AFC housing in was really tame. Everything was pulled back. So even though someone had gone in and loosened off that AFC star wheel, this foot was moving out of the way really quick. When I first tested it by 10 PSI, it was already maxed out. But this thing doesn't move a lot of fuel, or it didn't before. So maxing out the travel of this wasn't that bad happening that early. Now with all this travel that we have, and I am moving the plate forward a little bit, we have to think about things, because I don't want this being super loose. I don't want it just whacking right to the far side at really low boost, because essentially this means let's give it a ton of fuel with no air. So I like to see this gradually come on, and I like to see it, like if we're all in, let's say if I hit this far end by 20 PSI, 25 PSI, I'm happy. Essentially, we're gradually increasing fuel. So watch, it starts moving right away, and it used to bottom out right at 10 PSI. I now tightened the spring up. My travel is still going. Takes about 20 PSI now. A little after 20 PSI, it maxes out, and I like that. So, jumping in again. These settings with the AFC, man, there's so many different ways you can have stuff set up. You imagine if I have a small amount of fuel, I have a single turbo that I'm only going to be pushing to 30 PSI. I can have this AFC foot max out by 20 PSI. My turbo is going to be able to handle everything. Everything's going good. But you imagine if I have a triple compound setup like what you see in the picture, and maybe so that combination goes from 0 to, let's say, 150 PSI boost. Now that is a huge swing in boost and a huge swing in airflow entering the engine. Imagine if I have just garden hose injectors and I have like a monster injection pump, 14 millimeter, 16 millimeter, I don't know. If you just have monstrous amounts of fuel, you can't have all that fuel come in at 30 PSI. You're going to want, let's say, your total amount of fueling to somehow be spread out over the boost range that you're going from 0 to 150 PSI. It's funny, this AFC, we're trying to tailor our fuel curve like you would do on an EFI software program, but like we just have these mechanical tools and a spring to try to achieve this equal air to fuel, or exactly how we want it throughout the RPM range and throughout the boost pressure range. You can put in longer springs, you can put in stiffer springs, you can put in all kinds of stuff to try to create this AFC that's going to work with the fuel and how your combo kind of comes up on the turbos. And yeah, unlimited sort of ways that this can be set up. But if once you understand what you're doing and how this works, you can think about it and try to make it match what you want it to do. So this will ensure that we're going to have a certain amount of air available to burn the fuel that's going to go in. If we have that AFC foot move out of the way too quick, you're going to dump a pile of fuel in before you have air. And every combo is different. Like I say, depending on, do you have a single turbo? Do you have compound turbos? What size of injectors do you have? Where your pump is set up? You might have a ton of air at really low, 10, 15 pounds of boost. Maybe you got a really small compound turbo setup. You might have a monster amount of air at 20 to 30 pounds of boost, like pounds per air density kind of thing. You might have a lot of air. Wow, this thing could move a little bit quicker. It could move a little bit farther. Maybe you got a big single turbo, and again, all the different things that change in your combo change how we want this thing to react. So how we set this up is kind of like it's the characteristics on how our fueling is part of it, because this is the air fuel control. So this is fuel reference to boost. We need boost before we start to get fuel once the AFC moves out of the way. So it's like that transition point. This is the very start of the entire fuel curve. How much fuel we have from just off idle. When we whack the throttle, it's the pre-boost screw. It's our smoke screw, whatever you want to call it. We're setting this initial position. It's how far the rack can go with no boost. So we kind of have many parts of this transition. Going from idle to wide open throttle. Initially, we'll have the first little bit it can move. That will start the whole process. We'll start to build a little boost. Now the AFC is like the transition in between no boost. Well, just off boost to max fuel. The smoke screw sets the initial amount. The AFC covers the transition from the initial to, because essentially once this maxes out, it's out of the way, and now the fuel plate takes over. So we have sort of the initial fueling, we have the transition fueling. The AFC controls how we get from very little fuel to our max fueling, which will end up being our fuel plate. Hope this is making sense. Fuel plate location also comes into it now, fuel plate profile, because once this foot moves out of the way, now the governor is coming into contact with the fuel plate, which is fuel reference to RPM. And then that plate can be, the whole plate profile can be moved forward or backward. Okay, if you've been watching those other two videos, I'm gonna throw a whole another layer of stuff at you that you gotta try to wrap your mind around. So you remember when I was bench testing this and we could see the smoke screw setting on the back, set the initial AFC foot. Well, you know what it looks like. Down hanging in there is the AFC foot. You can see the fuel plate position I have it in, and then the foot is, that's right under there. It's gonna slide in between. So, but you look on a pump, we can slide that forward or backward quite a ways. So when the entire housing is moving, so is the AFC foot in relation to the leading edge of the governor arm, which essentially is the rack. So you got to take a minute to think about it, but it's like a whole nother level of what's going on. So that's why I marked this case when I first took it off, so I knew the exact position it was in when I started this process, because I knew the smoke screw was set really tame, almost perfect. So I want, if I put this back where I scribed it, I know my smoke screw setting is going to be deadly. I'll know that my AFC foot is in its original position, which is okay. My AFC has a lot of travel now, so that's not going to limit anything. A lot of guys will loosen off these bolts and they'll just slide the AFC all the way ahead. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's an adjustment that you can do. But you imagine what happens now is we had an initial setting where that AFC foot was sitting. Now that kind of is in reference to also where it's bolted on the case. If I have a smoke screw setting that's really good, so the initial position of the AFC foot, if I bolt this housing on and I slide it ahead that amount, that AFC foot just moved ahead that far. That governor arm is allowed to move ahead that far. The rack is allowed to move ahead that far. So essentially, it's like turning in the smoke screw at the back of the AFC housing. So like, there's a lot of layers of what's going on here. Some guys, if they don't max out the AFC, like all the tricks I just did, they want to move this thing ahead because it's almost the only way that AFC arm can kind of get out of the way of the fuel plate. But when you do all those mods to that AFC arm and it gives it a lot of travel, we can now set this farther back because we know inside that AFC foot travels quite a ways forward and it's likely not going to limit our travel. Like on my Mustang, I'm pulled back almost halfway. I still got a boatload of fuel. Where you'll almost always see everyone says full forward, but when you push it all the way full forward, now you kind of lose the ability to control your pre-boost. That foot is so far ahead that often it's way too far ahead, even if you back it out all the way. If you got big injectors, if you got, depending on your setup again, it can really change how things fuel. So just another kind of layer of all the little things that have to work together for a pump to kind of be tuned nicely and work good with the setup.